During my days as a campus minister at Mizzou, we had many different programs, different ministries. Two that came to my mind, just off the top of my head, one was that we would always pray for the lost and the wayward on other campuses, and top on our list was KU. How many are from KU? How many? You see, it worked. You're here. Then we prayed for the Sooners, Oklahoma. Anybody from University of Oklahoma? Well, they were lost then. So we would do that. A more serious ministry we would have though would be programming called the Last Lecture Series. And that was when we would invite a popular prof to come and give his or her lecture as if it were his or her last. In other words, it would be the most important thing that this professor would want to share. I'm beginning a series of sermons now called The Last Words, Final Words of Jesus, but could just as easily be called The Last Lecture of Jesus. Because I firmly believe that when you look at the 7 groups of words, utterances that he had on the cross, they make up a teaching, a lecture that he is giving us that we need to pay attention to. After all, he is giving this lecture with his own blood. As I have gotten into these sayings, and it's the first time in my entire ministry that I've ever focused sermons on one saying after another, I am just astounded. Astounded at the breadth and depth of this man, astounded how those words are like a magnifying glass, focusing the rays onto different amazing aspects of what his mission and message really are. So I would invite you to join me each Sunday from now on, with the exception of, in a couple of weeks, we have this very special musical from the children. But I would invite you to follow along those sayings, and a companion that I would invite you to purchase is the Final Words of Jesus, written by Adam Hamilton, the pastor at Church of the Resurrection. They will be available through our Faith Formation Department. You can call the office. They're also available, these books, online in e-versions. It is a resource that I would invite you to use as well with me in small groups on Wednesday nights after the Ash Wednesday service, starting those subsequent Wednesday nights at 6:30, as we use that to really dig even more closely into the words of the most amazing man who ever lived. Today, we begin this Lenten journey with the first set of words, first saying from the cross, and it's recorded only in Luke's gospel. Some think that perhaps there was a person very close to the cross that Luke had some relationship with, and that this person heard almost a whisper from Christ, the amazing words you're just about to hear. So, in honor of this gospel, as you're able, please stand.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 26, and verses 32 to 37. As they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene who was coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. They also led 2 other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on the left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." They drew lots as a way of dividing up his clothing. The people were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he really is the Christ sent from God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him, offering him sour wine and saying, "If you really are the King of the Jews, save yourself." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
How beautifully did that capture the chaos of the cross? A man beaten, stripped, hung up to die, with all soldiers, religious folk, all insulting and mocking him. And in the midst of all that, one person close to the cross hears, in the midst of all that, once again, hears, "Father, forgive them." And that one man who heard that must have instantly thought about how that thread just continued. Now that his ministry was ending, that thread goes all the way back to the very first sermon he gave, the Sermon on the Mount, where he said in the teaching the prayer, "So you forgive those who trespass against you, even as you have been forgiven." And how that man would have remembered those other sayings that Jesus said, such as, "You must be merciful to others, even as your heavenly Father is merciful to you." Or that parable about the man who had $1 million forgiven him, and he could not forgive $100 someone owed him. Or the story about the father of that prodigal son who welcomes the boy back, totally forgiven. And now, the first of the final words from the cross, "Father, forgive." How amazing. Now, if I were to preach a sermon on this, first point would be very easy. Forgive. If Jesus' first words on the cross as he was dying was to forgive the living, what in the world must we do? But you know, it goes even farther than that, even deeper than simply forgive. Because you think about that. Why was this the first thing off Jesus' lips? Why did he say that? Forgive. Could it be that he knew that he had hours of physical pain in front of him as he would bleed, as his lungs would continue to gasp for breath? And maybe, just maybe, he started this, "Father, forgive them," because he had to relieve his own soul. He had enough pain physically. Why burden himself with the anger and the feeling of being insulted and all the hurt that comes with that? Why burden his soul by holding that anger and that hatred in? So very first thing he had to do was relieve himself of that baggage on his heart. "Father, forgive, forgive." Maybe it's not simply that we have a command of Jesus to forgive others. Maybe it's because we have to forgive if we ever are going to live free and full lives. Because you know as well as I that continuing to harbor that the eye for an eye mentality does nothing but burden our soul. Keep us from living as Christ would have us live, even as Christ lived as he died on the cross. Last December, a man named Paul Goodwin was executed by the state of Missouri because he had murdered in a very awful fashion a woman back in 1998, a woman named Joan Krotz. Well, after appeal after appeal after appeal, and it was finally done, he was sentenced to die in December, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch interviewed the surviving daughter of Joan. And in the interview, she was asked, "Is there anything you'd want to say to Mr. Mr. Goodwin?" And she said, "I hope as he's going into the lethal injection room that he can see me, and I hope he can hear me say, 'I hope you rot in hell.'" Then she went on to say this, "It will be 16 years, 9 months, 10 days. I've been sitting back waiting for this execution to happen. I am hoping all these bad memories will go away." A short time after this interview, he was executed. And I would bet that all those bad memories did not go away. No matter how bad and awful and hard and difficult it is, you have to erase those bad memories by doing that amazing thing that Jesus did even on the cross. Dare to forgive. I'm really caught up by the words of a member of this church that I quoted 2 weeks ago in a sermon on forgiveness, when she talked about how she wrestled about the feeling she had for the murderers of her son, and how she came to this realization. Hating others just makes you so bitter and solves nothing. Hating others just makes you so bitter and solves nothing. It takes work to get to that point. And Jesus on the cross was simply doing what he had done every day of his life before this. Think about it. Think about how many people he could have held grudges against. I made a short list. Herod, who knocked off his friend John the Baptist and was after him. Villagers, even people from his own hometown who wanted to kill him after they heard the first sermon. The religious leaders, the self-righteous folks who wanted him dead, he could have held a grudge against them. The disciples, his friends, those who never understood him, those who constantly argued with him, those who ultimately betrayed, denied, and ran away from him. The disenchanted followers, the people who followed him up until they discovered that he wasn't going to give them what they wanted, so they cursed him and went away. Could have held a grudge against them. Or what about the people who were selling the sacrifices in the temple, desecrating his father's house? Could have held a grudge against them. The government officials. Pilate was top on his list, could have held a grudge against him because Pilate could have set him free. And of course the soldiers driving the nails into his hands and feet. And yet, every one of those groups or those people that you see, and others I couldn't even think of, Jesus forgave. Without even asking them to ask him for forgiveness, he forgave. And he did it with empathy. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Consider them, Lord. Consider them, Father. They don't know what they do. That's the first thing that struck me. How Jesus, even when he was dying, thought of the living and forgave. And then as I continued reading that over and over, that verse that you see on the screen, something else came up to me. It wasn't just to forgive in capital letters. It was forgive them, for they don't know what to do. Who is he talking about? Now, if we're going to take a survey, most people would say he's talking about the soldiers, right? Nailing the spikes into them. But think about that. For the soldiers, this was not anything personal. They didn't know this guy from any other self-deluded Messiah, from any other bandito, any other criminal. No, this is just another day on the job. They were just following orders. Who was Jesus referring to? It's not a specific group. It was a collection of people. It would have been the soldiers. It would have been Pilate. It would have been Herod. It would have been the Sadducees. It would have been the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots. It would have been you. And it would have been me. Because when you see those words up there, Jesus is asking God to forgive any who would insult and who would hurt him. And folks, we're all guilty of that, aren't we? As I was reflecting on those words, an old poem that I heard decades ago came back to my mind, a poem by the English cleric Studdert Kennedy. And he wrote a poem called When Jesus Came to Birmingham, talking about Birmingham, England, but listen. When Jesus came to Golgotha, they hanged him on a tree. They drove great nails through hands and feet and made a Calvary. They crowned him with a crown of thorns. Red were his wounds and deep, for those were crude and cruel days, and human flesh was cheap. When Jesus came to Birmingham, they simply passed him by. They would not hurt a hair of him. They only let him die. For men had grown more tender, and they would not give him pain. They only just passed down the street and left him in the rain. Still, Jesus cried, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And still it rained, the winter rain that drenched him through and through. The crowds went home and left the streets without a soul to see. And Jesus crouched against a wall and cried for Calvary. So the next time you're too busy to check Jesus' words, sayings that people died for just so that you had the opportunity to read them, or the next time you're too busy simply to have a prayer or a silent time addressing him, or the next time you're too busy to sign up for a mission opportunity to feed the hungry or to host the homeless. Next time, just remember how Jesus would take that. Because quite possibly, a pain worse than the nails is the pain of being ignored or trivialized. And too often, we do just that. And yet, Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them." Think about that. Because the next point is a thing that's most amazing to me, that's overwhelming. Yes, we have that non-compromising forgive. Look what I'm doing. I'm forgiving you, the one's killing me. And yes, we have that understanding that we are the ones who are complicit in Jesus' death. But you know what he's doing on the cross? He is not thinking of himself. The very first thing he does on the cross is not think about the blood, not thinking about how he can't grasp his breath anymore. He is thinking about you, and he is thinking about me. He is interceding for us. The biggest pain that any parent would have would be to see his or her child abused in some way. And the thing that would be even more horrific would be to see your child being crucified. And you know that day in Golgotha, you have the ground shaking and the clouds rolling in and the thunder and the lightning. God's anger at what's being done to his son. And God's son says, "Father, wait, forgive them." There are a lot of theories about how Jesus saves us through the cross. I've talked about some of them in sermons, like the substitutionary theory or the atonement theory or the exemplary theory or the Trinitarian theory. But it all gets down right to this. You know how Jesus saves us on the cross? He intercedes for us. And he says, "I forgive. Father, forgive." He takes our side even when we don't deserve it. If you came in here broken, kicking yourself, feeling like you don't understand yourself or others don't understand you, please understand that Jesus says, "I believe in you enough, I love you enough to forgive and to welcome you into a community of faith and healing." For that ultimately is the first message that Jesus gives us. For all are welcome, and whoever comes to me, Jesus says, I will in no way cast out, because you are worthy of forgiveness. And even as I die, I want you to live now and forevermore. On the cross, Jesus thinks not of himself, but of you. It has been said that if Jesus had never lived, it would have been impossible for him to have been made up. But he lived, and he died for us. In Adam's book, in this chapter on this verse, he talks of a young man in his Church of the Resurrection who had really made a mess of his life because in high school he got involved in drugs and alcohol. When he went away to college for the first semester, he really got caught up in the drugs and the alcohol. When he came home for Christmas break, he totaled his car and just barely escaped death. It was a wake-up call for the young man. And one evening, he goes into the sanctuary of the Church of the Resurrection, goes up to the cross, and simply embraces it. And he embraces it in silence as his tears fall. And in the silence, that young man heard, "Father, forgive him." In this Lenten season, as we start the journey together, may we have the honesty and the appreciation to approach the cross, linger there, and through God's grace, hear, "Father, forgive."